again. All right, so welcome to Early Modern English. We are moving along. We don't have that many classes left anymore, and today we are starting Early Modern English. This is Shakespeare's time. It starts from, the counting starts from around 1500 when there have been a lot of cultural changes, political changes in England, and then the end of the Middle English period is often said to coincide something that really is not part of the beginning of the Early Modern English period is said to coincide with an event, an external event that is technically still part of Middle English, and that's the printing press. William Caxton bringing the printing press into England in 1476, and that had a huge impact on language because it gave kind of like the beginning, it marked the beginning of the printed word, which meant that somebody printed those words and somebody had to decide which forms to use and whose dialect to use, and this is when the London dialect, which already during Middle English times had become the leading dialect because London was a big business center. It was close to where the courts were. It was an important city, and by the way, that's usually how it is in the world. The standard dialects tend to be affiliated with the capital cities or the big cities of educational centers or business centers and so on. So this is the time of Renaissance, looking back into classical languages, and that had a big influence on English lexicon specifically, because what was the biggest influence on English outside language influence during Middle English? What language? French, yes. And now English has won, in a way. English is as the language of the majority in the country, and so English is the language, but now we're starting to get into a situation where Renaissance involved this looking back to the classics, the classical languages, Greek and Latin specifically, and Latin influence was extremely strong during early modern English. English started to borrow from Latin and Greek a lot because there were new things to name. These inkhorn terms, it's a cute name for these terms. They started to proliferate. You get these long, typically long technical borrowings from Latin and Greek, and people can then mark that they are educated if they know how to use those terms and so on. Shakespeare is the author to mention from this time. Shakespeare's language is early modern English, and he also introduced a lot of new words because he was really good with language, of course. And King James Bible was published during this time, and it's still being used in some churches, and it was published in 1611. Language internal changes include, as the most significant, the great vowel shift, and we'll focus on that in a moment. But before we do that, let's start this segment with the Lord's Prayer. We're looking at it from the point of view of its language, and let's read it together line by line or phrase by phrase, and we will see that this is early modern English is a language that we can already understand. Middle English was kind of too. We can understand that, but there has been, you notice when we do this, that this is almost like we speak today. But there are still some pronunciation differences. So let's get this done. Our Father. And that little IPA symbol at the end of, actually it was more pronounced like feather, or feather. This E with a little squiggly thing, it means that there was an R, some kind of an R at the end of it, but not necessarily. So, feather. Which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come to. Thy kingdom come, I'm sorry, come. Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen. Okay, so it's very understandable, and I'm reading it with my Finnish accent, so I apologize for all those native speakers of early modern English. Early modern English was first, it was called modern English, and I am not that ancient, but still when I was studying this, it was called modern English, and it kind of like ran to and this is like in the 1970s, so it's later that we have started to talk about early modern English. And that's, kind of like how we demarcate these things. Like Old English, it wasn't old when it was spoken. Middle English was not middle when it was spoken. Modern English was, from our point of view, it's now early modern English. And then to our language, we refer to as present day English. So here are just, and I'm posting this, so you don't need to write this all down. I'm going to be posting the PowerPoint on the website, not website, but Blackboard. So here are just some questions that when you read through the early modern English text in your textbook. First of all, know that we start from 1500 and this period ends around 1800, and then after that, whatever varieties of English we have, we refer to them as present day English. Why do these dates mark the beginning and end of early modern English? Just something for you to think about when you read the text, your textbook. Why is early modern English period called the period of the self-conscious language? And we'll look into that soon. There was this prescriptive tradition that became really strong during the early modern English period because people wanted to know what is the correct way of saying this, and people started to dictate how English should be used if it's formal English, for instance. That's in contrast to the descriptive tradition, which we use when we teach about grammar, for instance. We don't say you have to do this. We just say this is how English speakers do things. So which languages affect English during this period and why? For instance, what's the role of Latin during this period? It's big. Where did the majority of loans come from? Latin and Greek. Other influences still continued. Dutch, French continues, of course. What are the reasons for this? And early modern English lexicon. Now, I posted on Blackboard a video. It's about 15 minutes long, so it takes a good chunk of your time, but you can use the class time on Friday and view that video. It's kind of entertaining. It lists a lot of words and where those words came from, and it's worth watching. It's a BBC documentary about early modern English, about Shakespeare's language, and the documentary takes you to Stratford-on-Avon, where Shakespeare was born, where he died. So it's an interesting documentary. So early modern English phonology, a lot happened there because there were changes in the consonants. Assimilation is the same thing as what your book refers to as palatal assimilation. It gives the details, and there is a really good exercise also in your book to go over. So then the great vowel shift. Today's topic, what was the general trend, which vowels were affected, specific examples, affected words. Why do we, for instance, say steak and not steak today? What was the influence of the printing press and on how English is written? Look at also changes in morphology and syntax. Morphology and syntax was mostly affected during Middle English times. The greatest change to language during early modern English is the great vowel shift. What are the general trends? However, of course, the general trend over the centuries has been the simplification of paradigms, and that continues in early modern English. It still continues today. Semantics and word formation processes, and then a little bit about early modern English dialect. So these are the kinds of things that keep in mind when you do the readings and go over the posted materials. So, and again, I'll post these, so if you didn't get it all down, that's okay. So early modern English, it's very often referred to as a self-conscious language, and that was partially caused, or to an extent, to a large extent caused, or went together with the introduction and dissemination of printing. Because if something gets printed, then people get kind of like, okay, is this the way we really say this thing? Is this the way we should be saying things? And so on. And William Caxton had a really big effect on the English language because he brought that first printing press in 1476. Also during this time, and this is just a quick overview about those issues that are important for early modern English, the Renaissance is important because that means that people were looking back to the classical languages, and what the educated people had been able to read Latin and Greek, but of course the educated people is a tiny minority in that world, and what they wanted to do is to bring these great writings to a larger population to learn from and to enjoy. And that became possible because of the printing press, because the manuscripts, that was an extremely tedious process to copy a manuscript, like for instance, Chaucer's manuscripts. There is a number, actually there are many Chaucer's manuscripts still available because he was so popular. But what you first have to do, you have to go and kill an animal, a sheep, and get the sheep skin in order to start writing on the and treat it with with the tedious process. And then you have to write it by hand. Imagine, you know how long Canterbury Tales, for instance, is. If you have to write everything on a sheepskin, it's a big undertaking, and that's why, you know, books and reading and literacy was not common. But now with the printing press, the dissemination of literature becomes much, much easier, and that's what also made the translations of classical writings possible. What happened is this also, it's like a snowballing effect. When you translate a classical author, like, you know, Homer or Ovid or Virgil, and you translate it into your language, which has been affiliated with the peasants, right? The English language was the language of the great masses in England, not the educated people. So this means that the language itself, when you can read these classical great authors in your own language, English, it kind of elevates the language itself. That, you know, okay, if we can express these ideas in our language, these elevated ideas, maybe the language is elevated as well. So it added to the status of English. And it also led to a negative effect. It led to the comparisons of the English language with Latin. And of course, Latin and English are typologically different languages. They're both Indo-European languages. Latin, a Romance language, an Italic language, and English, a Germanic language. So they were different yet similar enough for comparisons. But what had happened during, of course, Latin is a relatively inflectional language. It uses a lot of inflections at the ends of words. And English had lost these inflections. English used to have many more. As we studied during Old English, it had those 4 cases, and verbs were inflected. But during Middle English, a lot of this inflectional richness had disappeared from English. And now we have a different kind of a language, typologically, an analytic language. But people started to compare it to Latin. And then there were these attempts to improve English. And we are still suffering from that today. When you take a freshman composition class, if you had to take it, then you know that there are all these rules like don't end a sentence with a preposition, because a preposition is a word you should never end a sentence with. We use it all the time. We do it all the time. We end sentences with prepositions, but yet there is this rule, that actually a written rule, if you look at the handbooks, avoid ending a sentence with a preposition.
Yeah, and avoid passive voice.
Yes, avoid the passive voice, yes, and sometimes you are supposed to use the passive voice, like in a lab report, and so on. And we still, you write a document on your word processor, and you put it through the grammar check, and I mean, mine comes always, depending on what I'm writing, but usually I'm writing something for, like a formal piece, and it's like got red all over because it's passive, and you're not supposed to be using passive. But all these interesting rules. Also, one is don't split an infinitive. It comes from it's based on a Latin rule, because in Latin the infinitive is not splittable because it's just one word. And in English we have the two, and then you can say, I want to boldly go where nobody has gone before, and then boldly is splitting it to boldly go, splitting the infinitive, and that's been frowned upon based on this kind of like silly model of taking a model from another language, which is typologically different. The other rule is, I don't know where that even came from, because Latin has multiple negation, and that's grammatical in Latin. yet we have this rule: don't use multiple negations. So the rules of standard English, they are very, very artificial, but it's this prescriptive attitude that kind of took over during the early modern English times. Okay, so another interesting, important thing was the Protestant Reformation during early modern English times. In the beginning of that, it kind of marked the beginning of the early modern English times, and that is of course based on the idea that people should be reading God's word for themselves, and that spread literacy. So if you are allowed to read and understand and use for your growth and whatever, the reading of the Bible, then that meant that people could and should be able to read. The authorized version of the Bible came out in 1611. Of course, we know why the Protestant Reformation came to. Why the Catholic Church was no longer active to the extent it had been before, because of Henry VIII, who wanted to get a divorce. Divorce, yes, and Catholic Church is still has still a different approach to divorce than many other.
Yeah, but which typically it actually wasn't a problem, but it was because Catherine of Aragon, her aunt, was a niece of Charles the Fifth of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Pope was afraid that if he annulled that marriage, that Charles V would ransack and invade Rome.
It was all connected with politics, yes. Yeah.
The annulment, usually in any other situation, he would have gotten an annulment.
Yeah, good. Yay! Yes, so these are kind of like outside language, social and political events, yet they end up affecting the language as well, because language doesn't develop in a vacuum. So, enclosures, it's a social outside external event in the 1500s when big farms were combined with other big farms. That led to kind of like a movement of the peasants, and a movement from the countryside toward bigger cities. And that movement led to, obviously, urbanization, and also urbanization then meant the rise of the middle class. That there was this new class because the class society had been very clearly divided into those who work on the land and those who own the land. And now you go, large numbers of peasants go to the cities and acquire jobs there that were different from just taking care of the land. So that led to that middle class, and then this leads to prescriptive rules of grammar, because if people haven't been literate before, or if people are born to parents who are not literate, and then these people become literate, then you're kind of like always very self-conscious, because I come from this family where my parents couldn't read, but now I've learned to read, and how am I going to fit in with that middle class, which is expected to use language in a particular way, because we mark our identities with our language, so we can shift identities by shifting to a different kind of a dialect, a social dialect. So all those kinds of issues were going on. Then later on, during the early modern English time, we have the Industrial Revolution, which means more intensive urbanization, more and more people coming to cities to work in the factories. And that also led to a need for names for all these manufactured items and items that were used to manufacture them. So there was a lot of need for technical vocabulary, and very often those were taken not from the Anglo-Saxon own native word stock, they were very often borrowed. This was a time, early modern English time was the time of exploration and colonization, which meant that when people went to faraway places to trade, and they brought in all kinds of items which needed names, and very often the names were borrowed together with the items. And we know all the horrible things that also was going on during that time. But people came into contact with other cultures, whether that was a positive contact or negative, whatever, but that added to the loanword stock. The American Revolution happened also towards during the final century of the early modern English period, and that then led to multiple national Englishes. So American English developed as an identifiable variety of English. The people divided by a common language, right? Wasn't that one of the sayings? So there were a lot of debates about vocabulary. If you imagine a world where new words keep pouring in, then that's kind of like a topic of conversation as well. And borrowing continued also, but the Latin influence was extremely important. There were, at this point, we notice a situation where language English is starting to be, the written form of English is starting to be quite different from the spoken form of English, and that's mostly because of what happened to the vowels in the great vowel shift. So by the beginning of the early modern English period and by the end of the Middle English period, the 16th century, the effects of the great vowel shift were making English correspondence between the vowel and the vowel symbol very different from what it was in many continental languages like French and Italian, Spanish, where what you see is what you hear very often. But in English, that started to be no longer the case. So we have instances because of the great vowel shift, and here I have just listed, and we'll look at this in more detail in a minute. But we write the word mice with a letter I. We call it a letter I, but of course in Middle English it was pronounced as meese. Meese, we say it mice today. So what happened was E, the long E, it became I in the great vowel shift. E became I, meese became mice, lees became lice. Also moose, the singular, became mouse. So the long, let's mark this as a long E because it's only the long vowels that were affected by the great vowel shift. So U became ow. E became I and U became ow. And this is something that still goes on in different dialects of English. You can hear the diphthongized sounds. Sometimes a diphthong is monophthongized, like in Texas English you don't say hi, you say a more monophthongized version, ha, and sometimes you diphthongize vowel sounds like heel instead of heel, and we can find, you know, plenty of examples of these kind of changes to vowels still going on. Now, vowels are very vulnerable to change because, as we know, when we talked about vowels, they are not pronounced in exactly the same place in the mouth, or it's different from consonants, because for consonants we can define the place of articulation very clearly and the manner of articulation, but for vowels it's more vague, right? Okay, so moose became mouse, and geese became geese. So the long E, it went up. So E became E, geese became geese. What we are still doing today, though, see how we write it? We write it as if we still lived in the Middle English times with the long E sound, but we don't say geese like in Middle English, it's geese in present day English. Already that change happened in early modern English. Now it's singular. Goose is pronounced as goose, but look how we write it. We write it as if we lived in Middle English times. So O, the long O, went up, right? Became an U. The low, the lower, the more open E, the long E, also went up. So breken, E, became E, break, and very recently this has been diphthongized, so we don't say break, we say break. So E has become A in very recent development. Also the open O went up and became the more higher, more closed O. So broken O became O. Broke, eventually became O, like diphthongized, broke, but it was broke, this higher, okay? And there's one more, the low, like the word name in Middle English, name, it became name. And this E, of course, is diphthongized in present day English, but typically it's just, you know, marked as E. So name became name. So this one went up here. Those are just examples of the great vowel shift. And what you can notice is that it's actually a really simple and it was relatively uniform process. So the high vowels, E and U, the long high vowels, they became diphthongs. So E became I and U became AU. And now we have basically we have a situation where there is no Theoretically, there is no E and there is no U, and that allows the middle vowels to go up and change so that E became E and O became U. And now this allows the next level of vowels, the E and O, the open E and O, to claim the place of the higher one. Yes?
You mentioned earlier that the London dialect was becoming the dominant form of English. Is the great vowel shift only happening in the London dialect or all over English?
All over. All over, and that's the amazing thing. And nobody wants to commit of why it happened. So how does this type of internal language change? Why does it happen? It's just like, some people, a group of people, start pronouncing a vowel in a particular way. Like, oh, I'm not going to say me's anymore. I'm going to start saying, it with a mice, I, and then it spread to all the pronunciations of that particular group of people. And often, if these people are cool people, then everybody wants to kind of like start speaking like these cool people. And so it was something that happened in the London dialect, and if you go to England, you can go to places, especially in the north, where the vowels are quite different from the standard London dialect. So it's as if they hadn't been participating so fully in the great vowel shift. Yes?
Yes, I think, I might not be right, but I think Sean Bean is from Yorkshire. Okay. Or somewhere, isn't he like from north?
I don't know.
But anyway, if you listen to him, he definitely does not have like the London pronunciation.
Would he be from? I don't know.
I think he's from North England.
Okay,
so.
all right. Yes.
So, yeah.
Like the Yorkshire dialect is very, very different. Yeah.
So some of his colleagues that are also English kind of they like to make fun of him a little bit for his pronunciation.
Yes, and you can kind of like mark where you come from by pronouncing the vowels. But this is a really interesting internal language change, because it kind of like went all over the place. So what happened is this is the nutshell of the great vowel shift. All the Middle English long vowels, they came to be pronounced in a higher position, like miraculously came to be pronounced. But of course that was a gradual, slow process, and it spread from one group of speakers to another group of speakers, but it affected all the long vowels of Middle English. So that it wasn't just like, this word is pronounced like mice is pronounced, me's is pronounced as mice. It was all the long E's, they became I. So it was a very huge change. Now, the vowels that were already in a high position, they so to say, fell, or they became diphthongs. So E became I and U became ow. And then the short vowels, they were not affected at all. They changed in some other ways, but they did not participate in the great vowel shift. That affected only long vowels. When did this begin? It started in late Middle English, and it was completed around the end of the 16th century, except for this change when the low A first became E, it sometimes went all the way to E, and that had not been completed quite yet. So in the next slide, what I have is where we started from, before the great vowel shift. These are the Middle English long vowels: e, e, a, u, o, the open o, and these are the ones that started to change. So this was the starting point for the great vowel shift, also sometimes referred to as the great vowel movement. And this is what happened. So I once had a graduate student who was asked in an oral test to describe the great vowel shift, and she said, it's this butterfly thing. If that helps you to remember how it goes, that's fine. But also know something more about it. So that is basically what happened. And you've got this in your book, and I'll post this also, but this is kind of like, it kind of materializes the simplicity of the change that, this once E and U had become diphthongs, then you have this. It's kind of, some people refer to it as a pull change, that these empty places are pulling the lower vowels, but some people want to call it a push chain, that these would be pushed. It doesn't really matter how you want to see it, but the end result is a big systematic change. And here is just the change, how it looks like. So once I had developed from E and Au had developed from U, then you could have this change, this moving further up of all the long vowels. And this is the result. So in early modern English you have E and E and the diphthongs I and Au and U and O, but these had kind of disappeared. This is not disappeared as vowels, but this is the result of the change, and these are what we still have today. And this is the great vowel change is the reason why we have such discrepancies in how we write things. We still write as if we were in Middle English. We write mies, but it's pronounced mice. We write geese, but it's pronounced geese. So after the great vowel shift, vowel length was no longer phonemic. Now what this means is that the vowel length, whether you have a short vowel or a long vowel, that doesn't make a difference in the meaning of the word. Like, remember we had that from Old English, God is God, God is good. The change now is a qualitative change, not a quantitative change of length, and that's what the situation is now in most English dialects. So there are qualitative differences in vowels that are shorter, they are lax vowels, and then the tense vowels, they still tend to be longer, but the main difference is a qualitative change. Example of this, the Middle English word bit had the short I vowel, and the Middle English also had the long I in bite, so bit or bite, and then the e at the end of bite. It first became a schwa and then it disappeared altogether. So at one point in Middle English you had the words bit and beat, where length is the key factor in the interpretation of bit versus bite, right? Okay. Now the great vowel shift enters the picture in early modern English does not affect bit. Why does it not affect bit? It's a short vowel. It leaves it as it is, but the E in beat changes and becomes bite, like all long E's became I's. So now what we have is not a length determined difference in the two words bit and bite. It's a qualitative difference between a lax vowel E and a diphthong I. Okay, does that make sense? Great. Okay, and this is, don't start writing it, it's the next homework assignment, and I don't know if anyone is happy to hear this, but this is the final homework assignment number 4. So, so I will be posting this on Friday or by Friday, and you'll return it the same way as you've been returning the other stuff. Just a quick point, it does require the long indication of the long sounds, but I will either provide those for you so that you can copy and paste, or then we'll eliminate that requirement of how to mark this. There's plenty of stuff to do here. Anyway, you have probably noticed that my homework assignments are like little teaching instances also, that you study the instructions and you learn from the instructions and then you go ahead and apply. So, okay, I will probably post this, but we covered the great vowel shift, and the great vowel shift also, it has led to a devastation in reading poetry that is supposed to rhyme, because now you have these changed vowels, and just really quickly, Alexander Pope, a great poet, but you read his lines: soft yielding minds to water glide away, and sip with nymphs their elemental tea. So away and tea. Why is he a great poet? He doesn't even rhyme. But he did rhyme before the great vowel shift spoiled it all. And here another couple of lines from Pope. But thou, false guardian of a charge too good, thou mean deserter of thy brother's blood. Good and blood doesn't rhyme, but it did. Good and blood. So I'll post these last couple of things, but it's kind of interesting. But now you know the great vowel shift, and now you can make Pope rhyme again. Thank you.